Tim Linder here. Let's talk about the layers panel inside of Photoshop. If you don't see the layers panel down here in Photoshop, you can go to Window, Layers, and open up your layers panel. You can think of layers kind of as a way of organizing elements within your photo, one on top of one another in a separate maybe sheet of transparency over the top of one another. So it's probably easier if I kind of show you how we go about doing this. So right now with a regular JPEG that you might open, you're going to have a locked a background layer, right? I don't have any other layers, but you can create another layer with this little button here, or you could click on the fly out menu here and choose new layer from there. But there's a new layer icon right here that you can choose from. And so if I were to create a new layer, I notice over here on the right side in my layers panel, it's going to give me a little kind of gray and white checkerboard, and it says layer 1. Now I can add anything I want to that new layer if I want to. I'm just going to get my paintbrush over here, and I'm just going to use blue there, and I'm going to get a little bit of a larger brush. I'm hitting the brackets next to the P key on my keyboard, and I'm just going to brush in a brush stroke. And so now I see this layer panel has a little icon of those blue brush strokes in layer 1. Now I can rename that layer if I want to. I could right click on it and choose rename. I can hit the double click on layer here and call this blue paint stroke. Okay, so this can be worked with independently from my background. So notice my background or my blue paint stroke. I can highlight and work with either one of these. So if I've got my blue background or my blue paint stroke selected and I go over and get my move tool, I can move it independently from the background. Or if I choose image adjust, hue and saturation, or any other adjustment, and I work with it, notice it's working with this layer rather than the background. Or if I select my background and if I were to go to image adjust, hue and saturation, and drag my saturation slider around, notice the blue stroke isn't being adjusted and the background is. So I've got these two elements that I can work on separately, right? If I wanted to delete a layer, I could just click and drag it to my trash can and I can delete it, or I can hit the delete key. Now if I were to have created that blue paint stroke on the top of this current layer, on the background layer, I could have still used my paintbrush and painted that blue stroke there, but I can't work with it independently. I've kind of lost, or I've deconstructed this image and painted over the top of it, just as if I were to paint over a painting with spray paint or a paintbrush. I've kind of ruined what's underneath it. If I were to have laid a transparency sheet of paper over the top of my painting and then painted on that, I could work with it independently if you want to think about it in real world sort of scenarios. I'm going to choose Command Z to undo that. So I've got these different layers. Now you can also, and we may have talked about, make your background layer a regular layer so that if you were to, you can cut holes in it and look through the background. So right now, if I were to use my eraser tool, I'm going to use the brackets next to the P on the keyboard to get a larger eraser. But if I would use an eraser tool and I click on this, I'm just kind of erasing my image, and then whatever I've chosen as my background color, it's going to erase to whatever the color that is, right? So if I use my eraser tool, I'm just kind of erasing that image. However, if I click on the unlock button here and I use my eraser tool, I'm going to erase, and it's going to erase back to transparency. Transparency is visualized in Photoshop as this kind of gray and white checker box. So I can see back behind this image to transparency, or back behind this layer to transparency. So if I were to create a new layer and then let's say create a paint stroke again, we'll do a red one this time, and I paint just some sort of a red paint stroke here on this layer. If I were to wanted to arrange these layers differently, I could do that as well. So let's say I wanted to take layer 1 and put it underneath or behind layer 0. So if I click and drag it here, it's going back behind it. And since I have layer 1 selected and I use my move tool, I can see, oh, there's that circle. It's back through the little hole I cut in this image, right? So the stacking order of which the layers exist in the layer panel has to do with what is in front and what is behind when you visualize these layers. Okay, I'm going to hit undo a few times and go back to my original image, okay? So if you start to create layers, or you don't have just one locked background layer, there are some file formats that won't allow you to be able to save, right? So right now I could go to File, Save As, okay? And I've got all these options here, JPEG, and I'm going to move my panel up a little bit higher so you can see it. So I've got all these options here that I could choose from, but full list of options that I can choose from. But as soon as I change this layer, let's say I create a new layer, or I were to unlock that, there's certain file formats that don't allow for you to save in layers. So Photoshop doesn't even give you the option at first to save in those. So now that I've got some layers, and there's some other features in Photoshop that are the same, but if I were to go to Save As now, and I choose this, notice my list is much smaller, because these are the only file formats that will allow you to save in layers. So Photoshop tries to prevent you from saving as a JPEG or a PNG or some other type of format that doesn't have layers, because then you'll lose your layers. You won't necessarily lose what was on that layer, but it'll collapse everything into one layer, and you'll lose the ability to work with it independently. So from there, Photoshop, if you want to save as a JPEG, you got to save as a copy or some sort of new file format. So as soon as I choose Save as a Copy, it adds the word copy to the end there, and that way I'm not saving over my original, and I've got some ability to choose all these other file formats. So as soon as you create new layers or unlock your background layer, Photoshop starts the process of trying to keep you from hurting yourself and collapsing layers, and giving you the ability to work with them independently. You can also collapse them yourself. So let's say that I created this paint stroke here, and then I said, you know what, I don't need to work with this in layers anymore. I can go over here to my layer panel. I'm going to pull this out so you can see it. I'm going to go over here to my layer panel, and I'm going to choose Flatten Image. And what that does, it takes all the layers, no matter how many you've got, and flattens them back into one flattened background layer. Now, I don't have the ability to work with them separately anymore, but now it is a flattened image. And if I were to go into, why might I not be getting it in there? There we go. Oh, having trouble getting that panel back in there. Snug it back in there. There we go. So if I were to go to File, Save As now, that I've got this flattened image, it gives me the JPEG option and all those options again, right? I'm gonna undo that, or maybe I'll just go back to File, Revert, and revert to my original image. So that is what's helpful about these layers and being able to work with things independently. And sometimes you'll have a lot of different layers that you'll work with, not just one or two. You might have up to hundreds of different layers that you will work with when you create different works of, when you're editing photos, right? And oftentimes when you're designing with it too. Sometimes Photoshop automatically creates a new layer. We'll work with typography later, but if you were to go in and get your type tool and create some type, and I'm gonna automatically here, Photoshop gives me the character panel. So if I were to create a type layer, notice that there's some different layers that I'm looking at. I've got this automatically created typography layer, right? And if I wanted to save this as a JPEG, right now I could go back and re-edit things and highlight typography, or so, you know what, I don't like that color. Maybe I want to grab the yellow from that leaf to be the color of my typography. I could do that sort of thing and work with this layer independently, okay? But if I wanted to save it as a JPEG, I'm going to have to save it as a copy. And so I might want to save a couple different versions. I might want to save as a Photoshop file, so I always have the ability to come back in and grab my typography in there and work with it independently, or edit edit my type if I made a misspelling or something like that. But I also might want to save a copy as a JPEG that I could send off to somebody that might not have Photoshop, or upload to the web or something like that, right? So these are your layers. Now, you've also got some options within your layers, okay? So let's create a couple different things. I'm going to, let's say, take and create a kind of a rectangle maybe underneath it. So I'm going to get my rectangle tool here, and I'm just going to create a a shape layer, a rectangle here, and so this was a shape layer that I'm creating, and notice a different type of layer. Now I can take different elements and hold shift and select them, and I could go in here and merge them together if I just wanted those two layers together combined as one and work with individually. I could merge those layers, and right now if I use my move tool or something like that, my V key here, it's moving those together, but I can't work with them independently anymore, so I'm going to undo that. Another thing that I could do to combine those together is hold shift and select those layers and come down here and choose, put them in a folder and group them together. So now I've got this group. I could rename this group if I wanted to, but now I can work with them together individually if I wanted to by selecting in this group, or I could work with them open the folder up and work with them individually. Now, one of the things that I notice with my move tool over here, it says auto select layer. So even since this, if I turn this off, notice that I can work with the group, and now I'm moving everything together. If I have this auto select layer on, or I could auto select an entire group if I have several groups, but if I have auto select layer and I click on the layer that has the trees, notice what happens. It's going to open this folder and automatically select the tree layer for me. So that's what that little auto select does. But if you've got them in a folder, you've got that turned off, you can work with these individually, open it up and select either one of these individually and work with it. Anything that you want to do, image adjustments or the move tool or eraser, or however you wanted to work with those, you could work with them individually. Now another thing that I can do is choose some options. Right now I've got a fill and a stroke. I could change the opacity of that fill. And notice the difference there between the opacity and fill, and we'll talk about it more when we get to layer styles. But if I go in here to opacity, it's changing everything, the layer style, the stroke, and everything. And if I just do the fill, it's changing the opacity of just the inside and not any effects or strokes that are on that layer. Now, if I'm using something that doesn't have any stroke or effect, it doesn't really matter whether I'm using fill or opacity. Okay, so these are just some options. I can also hide layers if I wanted to, or hide groups. So I could hide this bar, or I could hide the word tree if I want to. I can also lock things in place if I want to lock this whole group, and that way I can't move or edit it. It's locked over here, and I could lock only its position or my ability to paint on it or those sort of things as well. So this is my layer panel and what I can do with my layers.